What would you do if...
Hello, welcome to Creative by Konstantin, where we give you life hacks from music's best. Like and subscribe us so that you know when our next episodes are out. I'm delighted to introduce to you internationally renowned pianist and harpsichordist, educator, and recording artist, Magdalena Baczewska. And we're going to talk about being a pianist and a harpsichordist, choosing meaningful performing and recording projects, and of course, fashion and importance of personal style in our industry. Magdalena, welcome.
Thank you so much, Konstantin. I am thrilled to see you and to be on your new podcast, which I find just fascinating and fabulous.
Thank you, and so are you. So I like to begin at the beginning and ask you, do you remember what made you choose music as your path in life?
It's funny that you just mentioned it because I just 5 minutes ago finished recording a 90th birthday greeting for my first piano teacher. And I almost lost it while recording this greeting because all these memories came back about the love and the respect for music that this woman emanates, and the patience of a saint that she had for me and for all the other students. And, music with her was always such a special occasion. It was a kind of like a high mass kind of a feeling for which you made sure that you dressed properly, that your hair was all in place, and you were perfectly focused. And so these are my earliest memories of my piano lessons, which started when I was 5. But my parents tell me that the reason why I started piano lessons is that I became a little bit impossible with my sisters, who are younger by 2.5 years, and they're twins. So apparently the moment when I lost all the attention that I was getting from my parents, I became a little unpleasant to my baby sisters, and so they, as soon as I grew up enough to sit at the piano, they encouraged me to do that. And so my first lesson took place when I was 5. Of course, both of my parents are musicians, so there was always a piano at home. So whenever I would come back from watching a cartoon, I would try to play the melody that I had just heard on the piano. So it didn't come out of nowhere. So music was always there, and I do remember some of my earliest memories, period, are actually of my mother practicing the Franck sonata, the piano part,
Yes.
As I was taking my little baby nap. So it really was all music from the beginning. So it was almost inescapable.
That's wonderful. Those are great memories. Even though my family are not musicians, but I remember my grandmother playing the Moonlight Sonata and the sounds wafting through the apartment.
Oh.
But in a way, you can say that early start was already an understanding that music has a and kind of welfare and psychology and wellness all intersect, because it does have a calming effect, which your professional musician parents understood and steered you towards to get you to behave better, right?
Certainly. I think what they were looking for was mostly something to absorb me, and so that they could focus their attention on my little sisters, who, by the way, then later became professional musicians as well, playing violin and viola in professional orchestras.
Amazing.
But we would always, since they didn't have a babysitter, they would always drag us to their concerts as well and tell us not to move out of the seat, and until they come and get us in the intermission. So music and concert going was really my bread and butter. And I only grew to appreciate it later when I went to an actual school and realized that other kids did not live like that.
Yeah, that's a remarkable understanding once we look outside of the world of music, that life, in fact, may have forms in which music is in the center.
Exactly. And I don't know if you still remember the communist years, back home, but I grew up in Poland. And so there were very few distractions in this kind of life. It was not an easy life, but it was very simple in that you went to music school and there were no video games. There were no other things to do, horseback riding or anything else. So you came home from class and you practiced the piano like you saw your parents do. And there was very little to want. There was no merchandise ever in the stores, for example. So the list of desires was rather limited. I also remember the television had only 2 channels, and the cartoon that we watched was only 10 minutes long. There was no cartoon channel or anything like that. But I do remember that culture and concerts, and especially the greatest event every 5 years, the Chopin piano competition in Warsaw, was actually broadcast live in its entirety throughout on channel 2, one of the 2 channels. And so these were the priorities. And only when I came to New York at age 18 did I realize that not everybody lives like that.
How was your transition from Poland to United States? Did you experience a culture shock in a sense that people usually refer to it?
I actually experienced much less of it, if any at all, than my roommate, who was from Ohio, rural Ohio. I come from a small city, but still a city, a coal mining city of Katowice, about 500,000 inhabitants. And yes, there was pollution, traffic, noisy public transportation that made me prepared for life in New York. And of course, New York is more like a fairy tale where everything you do is on steroids. No matter how high up you look, there's still buildings that you see, and that excitement, I don't think it ever wore off on me.
Yeah, well, New York never fails to surprise us with higher and more elaborate buildings, right? Were you first year in New York at the dormitories?
Yes, I lived in a dormitory of Mannes College, and it was on 73rd Street. And that was the one moment in my entire New York life, which now has lasted 22 years, that I wanted to go back home. And that was when I saw my first cockroach. I thought, yes, we never lived in great riches, but cleanliness was of utmost importance at home. And when I saw that thing crawl on the bathroom floor, I thought, oh no, that's it, I'm going right back. But luckily, I had a wonderful network of friends, and especially my piano teacher here, Jerome Rose, who was the very person who asked me to come and study with him in New York once we met in Warsaw during a master class. And so he sort of became a father figure, the person who would invite me to all the Thanksgiving dinners while everybody else would disappear from the city, really, because campus, I shouldn't really call the Mannes College a campus. It was just a building on the Upper West Side.
Yes, I remember, yes. Well, it's a beautiful story. There are a lot of stories like that in the music world where the teachers really become a parent figure and really open the doors to their home. And I think it really contributes to not only relationship, but to sort of sense of belonging when you come to a new country. I get asked the same question, was I shocked culturally, or was I lonely or lonesome? And I didn't have that either, because of, my teacher and the mentors in my life who've done the same, Christmases and Thanksgivings. And, I never felt that I was alone in a strange city or a strange country.
Mm-hmm, certainly. And that's something that you then absorb as a teacher yourself, and as a person who is in a position of now giving back. You do the same. We had a lovely Christmas dinner with some of my Chinese students and former students who came over, and I just couldn't imagine it any other way now.
Yeah, paying it forward. Yes, indeed. So you are a very rare combination of a pianist and a harpsichordist, and you're playing both so excellently, but they're such an opposite almost instrument. So I'm curious, it's a multi-pronged question. Did you always have interest in harpsichord, or was it something you developed as you were developing as a musician and as a pianist? And what was it like to begin playing one after the other?
When I was growing up in Poland, harpsichord was an instrument that people mostly made fun of, and they said it was reserved for bad pianists. You can imagine.
All right, yeah.
But it was also, in all fairness, it was before that huge resurgence of popularity of baroque music, and even the instruments themselves were not yet properly made. There were these very plasticky, very artificial and stiff-sounding instruments. So that was one thing. But I discovered the harpsichord at Mannes when I was an undergraduate student there, and I took a class called Harpsichord for Pianists with Arthur Haas, and I immediately caught the bug. It was not just that feeling under your fingers and in your ear where you simply feel on and off on that key, and you have to create a whole universe of expression with that very little, with those very few means. But also the aesthetic of this music completely took me by storm. Just studying the Couperin preludes from his treatise was already such joy and such discovery. I really felt like there was some sort of secret door opening up to me, and it took me many years to be able to switch back and forth from the piano to the harpsichord comfortably, so to control my technique enough to be able to play both at the same time, because even though they're both keyboard instruments, the weight that you apply to the keys, even your entire apparatus is very different when you sit down at the harpsichord. Not to mention that the knowledge, the standard knowledge that we acquire in conservatory on the piano proves to be completely useless with the music of, say, Frescobaldi or Froberger, where you really have to approach the score in a completely different way, read in between the lines, and realize that the score is merely a skeleton on which you build the piece, basically half improvising it. So that was so exciting and continues to be tremendous in my life as a musician.
It is. What I'm curious is, if you don't mind sharing, what is the specific technical adjustment that you do to your touch? Because the interesting and the most difficult thing about harpsichord versus piano is that being a plucked instrument, there is no, the tone quality, as it were, cannot be produced the same way that we, spend a lifetime finding those sounds on the piano. And then, of course, there is no decay equivalence to a regular piano. So in a way, you have to work with the sound, and correct me if I'm wrong, before you play it, because once made, it can't be manipulated. Whilst on a regular modern piano, the sound after you strike the key can be manipulated with energy and the pedal, of course, and all sorts of overtones and acoustic effects.
Most certainly. And you said it so well that once you've played it, it cannot be modified. Yes, so you have to do a lot of planning ahead of time, because once that string is plucked, this is it. So all you can really work with is articulation, so letting in air in between various notes, which also goes back to the fact that the fingering on early keyboards was completely different. So the thumb was not employed a lot because the keys were really much narrower and smaller, so there was no room for the keyboard player to use the thumb a whole lot. So the fingering was mostly done between the second, third, and fourth finger. Then, if you really wish to create a legato effect, for example, you should be doing what is called a super legato. That's something that Chopin actually talked about as well, where you overhold the notes and therefore create a feeling of a nice connected line. Otherwise, it all sounds really like typing. So articulation and timing are of essence. There are also good instruments. There are tricks possible where you slow down your approach to the key, thereby making the pluck go a little bit more gently on the string. So it is perhaps more psychological than anything else, but it does allow for a little bit of tapering off of the phrase. But again, that is, to do this in real time requires countless hours of preparation and experimenting. And then of course, once you've plucked the string, then you're also responsible for releasing the key, because it's also really heard, and it's a very defined moment in time when the key gets released, unlike on the piano, right, where the sound, as you said, decays in a very, very different way. So you have to control the beginning as well as the end of each sound that you make.
That is so interesting. And I don't play harpsichord properly. I mean, I tried a few times, and I just know how jarring it is to someone who's not used to that sound production, the experience of having this seemingly also a keyboard, but really completely different instrument in front of you.
Right.
And you've done this remarkable project playing the Goldberg variations on harpsichord and the piano in one performance. Am I correct?
Yes, it was a challenge that was assigned to me by Jerome Rose, the director of the International Keyboard Institute, and he thought it would be a fun thing to do. And I am still getting over the fact that I did it, because as you know, just imagine practicing for a recital where all you have to do is the Goldberg variations on a harpsichord. Then, after a few hours of setting that up, you sit down at the piano and you play exactly the same piece, but you now have to mold it into this different aesthetic and the sound world of the piano. So it drove me a little bit crazy, to be honest. But
I can imagine.
Yes, but that piece, you know, it just offers these endless possibilities. And so I made it a point to vary the interpretations enough so that the audience could appreciate how different they are on different instruments. And of course, just to even simply sit through that concert where the same piece is being performed twice.
How did you find the audience's response?
I loved what a friend of mine said, especially Gesa Luca. She's a wonderful German pianist. And she said, Magdalena, it was so enlightening in the first half, but then after the intermission, I thought, you know, you'd play in a normal way, you know, on the piano. But she said, it was far from normal. I took that as a great compliment because, you know, my big thing in what I do is to educate also through playing, not just showcasing the talent, because there are a lot of talented people out there and many more fabulous pianists than I am myself, but to give something that the audience can take with them and keep thinking about and learn from, that is something that I consider a successful event.
Well, and you do it in a very meaningful and easy to understand way. So that's also very important. But I'm curious, coming back to that performance, did you notice, were there a favorite among the audience between the piano and the harpsichord, or was it sort of 50-50?
Well, since it's a piano festival, and this was the only harpsichord performance offered probably in the entire history of the festival, it was an unusual experience for the audience, and I believe that majority of those who came were piano lovers, so they probably still stuck with the piano version as their favorite, but whoever I spoke to remarked on that learning experience that came with hearing the harpsichord. And it's of course a whole different experience as well for the listener. The sound of the harpsichord in a large concert hall is so much smaller and it almost disappears. So you really have to tune in very carefully to not miss anything.
I find that you almost have to go to the sound as a listener, as opposed to having sound come at you, which is what happens when we're playing modern piano. You know, we always play saying project to the hall. So the listener, the audience just kind of relaxes and get the wash of the sound at them. But with the harpsichord, the audience has to come to you.
Exactly. And this piece being one of the most intimate pieces in existence, I think also, you know, the challenge of performing it in such a huge auditorium that it was at the K Playhouse at Hunter College was almost unnatural. So it required a lot of the listeners.
Would you say which one is harder, to play first on the harpsichord and switch to piano, or first play on the piano and switch to harpsichord?
I certainly preferred to play the harpsichord first, because your touch, the required touch on the harpsichord is much lighter. And then once you have warmed up your muscles on the piano, it is very difficult to go back to the harpsichord. Although I have tried these types of events. A couple of days ago, Milana Strezeva of the Grand Piano Series did a watch party of my recital from a few years ago, where I was switching between the harpsichord and the piano. It was not easy, but I did that for variety's sake, so that the audience could experience the music of France from the 18th century, as well as the early 20th and late 19th century. So I do believe that no matter how much you love something, there is a moment where boredom sets in, and variety in a performance, and always kind of having your audience in mind and thinking about how their experience is. I think that's an important factor to keep in mind when you're planning your programming. I have seen a lot of recitals where musicians wish to showcase everything that they have ever learned, and then it turns into these endless displays of virtuosity, which are of course very impressive, but after a while everybody just gets tired of it. So I always try to keep in mind the actual state of mind of my potential audiences.
That's very wise, and I think it's what people eventually kind of look for in their experience as a concert goer. They want to learn something and feel things, and be entertained and educated in sort of equal measures, I think. But do you own a harpsichord?
Oh yes. It hasn't been a long time, but if you look behind me,
yes,
there is my baby harpsichord. I call
it. Oh, how wonderful!
It's a tiny English spinet. It's a copy made in the 80s in California, but it's a copy of an instrument that would have existed in the court of the Tudors. And apparently Henry VIII had as many as 6 of such harpsichords. They were, of course, very ornate and so on. But in the living room, I have another harpsichord, which is my blue Flemish double manual harpsichord, on which I can play pieces like the Goldbergs. This one is really great for things of the Fitzwilliam Virginal book, so the Renaissance keyboard pieces of England. But I have also been experimenting with the 2-part inventions on this instrument, and it does sound really lovely and sweet.
That's so interesting, and of course, I mean, they're so beautiful. I was just going to ask what the other one, Scholar, is, but I think I saw one of your videos on it. That beautiful sort of powder blue, and
I just put it like that, but it actually fits in really well with the apartment. And so see, another interesting thing historically, the Flemish, the Dutch, and I think it's the case until today, they did not like to show their money off. So if you look even in the golden age of the Flemish arts and the Flemish trade, people were wearing very modest clothing, very expensive fabric, perhaps, and you're getting at the fashion already, which is inevitable.
Yes.
A very expensive black fabric with a white color. There was no ornate jewelry and things like that. There were small statement pieces that were extremely expensive, but it would never be something flashy. And the same was the case with their homes, which they made sure not to make look too opulent. And also the instruments were made to sort of blend in with the interior, as opposed to the French harpsichords, which have gold, and, spiraling angels flying out of the paintings.
Louis XIV.
Yes, exactly. More is more. So I think that's also really interesting when you approach an instrument to sort of see it and feel its energy. Of course, this one is both are copies, but I also find that sober character of these instruments.
I'm curious if in today's performance practice, the harpsichords that are used, are they mostly contemporary made replicas, or are there some of them are actually 200-300 years old?
there are very few, really a handful instruments that to survive from the period. And the reason for it is the French Revolution, as you can imagine. So because the harpsichords were associated with aristocracy and all the things hated by the revolutionaries, they were used as firewood. And so unfortunately we have lost a lot of priceless instruments. Luckily in about the 60s, 70s, the movement of rebuilding harpsichords from paintings, from various treatises, became popular, and so that's probably responsible for the fact why a lot of the really successful harpsichord builders these days are hippies, because they
Right.
exactly at that time. And so I've had a privilege of meeting some of them, especially Willard Martin was and is such an inspiring figure, and continues to make wonderful instruments that have their personalities, just like, handmade pianos do.
Were yours built for you?
Oh, I wish. Maybe one day.
Next one. Yes. Is there any new music for harpsichords? Do you ever?
There is new music being written all the time for the harpsichord. The challenge is whenever you put a harpsichord in a space as a solo instrument, then it will require amplification and so on. But Henryk Mikołaj Górecki, who was, by the way, the husband of my first piano teacher, became very popular for his third symphony, sung by Dawn Abshow, made his pop music top 10 lists back in the early 2000s. He wrote a concerto for harpsichord and string orchestra, which is a fabulous minimalist piece. I have not yet had the pleasure of playing it. There is a piece by Ligeti, and music is still being written, but that's already a very different universe of sound.
Right. Of course. How do you feel about being mic'd if you're playing a harpsichord?
If it's done discreetly, I don't mind it. At the same time, I do believe that music should be performed in its original setting. And that's why my husband and I also are big fans of salons, at home, where we present the music to just a small handful of guests, the same way that it would have been done when the music was actually written. And those experiences, I think, tend to be more life-changing to the listeners than those where you are sitting a block away from the performer, because they truly feel the focus. They almost feel the sweat on your neck as you are making the music. So a lot of the responses we have received from these small events have been extremely strong, and so that's why I think that I would like to go with my music making.
No, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. It's almost like the audience is in on it. They're kind of participatory of what's going on. Now, speaking of interesting projects, such as the dual Goldberg variations, your discs, your recordings include a very interesting project of music for the dream. And I would like to know, how did you think about it? How did it come to fruition to create a soundtrack for sleeping?
Yes, you see, music is, as musicians, we usually try to keep people awake and interested. So when this project came about, I can't say that I was so enthusiastic at first, but it all originated from the Goldberg variations, which, as you know, were written for an insomniac, commissioned by Count Kaiserling, who just wished to have a piece of music to keep him entertained during his sleepless hours at night, not really to help him fall asleep, right? But so fast forward, okay, so I recorded the album with the Goldberg variations as a tribute to Glenn Gould, who has been my lifelong obsession, of course, in 2008. So as I was playing a recital to promote the album, Dr. Stern, and now my husband, came up to me and said, listen, I have just started a sleep practice and I would love to have an album for my patients to help them relax, something that is side effect free, and so I thought, well, boy, that's weird, but
I love it, side effect free.
Yes, and so I went into the studio and I did it. I picked pieces, and that was not an easy thing, because you need pieces that don't have large climactic moments, and most Western music does lead to that climax. So picking the repertoire was one thing. Then performing it in a totally different way than you would in a concert, that was also something I had to think about ahead of time. So when I got into the recording studio, I pretended that there's somebody sleeping next to me and I'm trying to keep them asleep. I also asked Joe Partridge, our wonderful friend and recording engineer, to place microphones in ways that make the sound a little bit more distant, a little bit more intimate, so that it's easy to doze off. And the music was also mastered in a more foggy type of way. So the albums became so popular. Well, we had the first volume, became so popular that we had no choice but to keep making them. And after a while, I was thinking, gosh, I think I'm going to run out of repertoire. But the feedback we received from listeners was truly magical. People would email us saying, you guys must have some magic powers, because my daughter takes 90 minutes every night to go to sleep, and with this album she wouldn't last past 3 first tracks, which were 4 or 5 minutes. So it certainly did something. I also made sure to organize the pieces according to their key structure. So if a piece ended up on D flat or C sharp, the next piece would follow at least from that same note, so that the sudden key changes wouldn't listen.
So that the entire record becomes a playlist that is curated for enhancement of that relaxation.
That's right. So we're going from, yes, to the most sort of sleepy selection. So as opposed to, as you said, these kind of playlists which are randomly put together, this was specifically curated to create that diminuendo, the diminishing of energy type of effects.
The decrescendo into slumber. I love this. This is so brilliant. And of course, I have to bring up the remix in 2020. That one I absolutely went crazy for, because it is your sleep music that has been hip-hopped and turned into like these psychedelic dance tracks. I don't know how better to describe them, but that's what it sounds like to me. And I'm a huge pop culture lover, but not a specialist in every style there is of electronic pop. Tell me, how did you meet the gentleman who did it? Pritzker, correct?
Yes, Gene Pritzker. It means a lot coming from you that you like it. And I have to say that, there have been people also who said, well, it's all great that you have this music, but we don't really like classical. So what can you do for us? And I myself don't listen to solely classical music. We have jazz, hip hop, old school rap, flamenco, all kinds of things playing at home. And I think that's a huge learning experience. And a pleasure to switch.
Of course, me too.
Right?
Love me some Madonna and Lady Gaga, right? and Adam Lambert and Cher. It's great.
Absolutely, it's just so much pleasure. So when I met Gene Pritzker, it was through a common friend, Vesco Gelev, who's a darling friend who's now in London playing with the London Phil. It was, I think, at the Poisson Rouge. It was one of the projects that they did as an absolute ensemble, and the concert was so full of funky energy. And I thought, wow, this guy, he's got something going on. He played the electric guitar, he conducted some pieces that he arranged, he also rapped on the spot. I thought, well, look at him. So we reached out to him for the first time when a Danish company called Metronaps wanted a short soundtrack to their sleep pods, which are these very fancy, cosmic looking nap kind of seats with a globe so that you can close to facilitate sleeping during the day, and all the
so Scandinavian.
Oh, it is indeed. And so Gene helped us with that, and it was just so easy and wonderful to work with him, because he really inhabits the whole world of music. For him, the genres don't really exist. He writes everything and explodes with that kind of creative energy. So there was, of course, no it was a no-brainer that Gene would be the one to do the remix. And what he did really exceeded my expectations. I basically just sent a sample of the classical piece that I was looking at. It had to be a piece that's more or less metronomic, or right, to fit within the beat. And what Gene did was so creative. He came up with a different vibe for each track.
Yeah.
There was some world music involved. There were instruments like, you know, Japanese shakuhachi, or there was Nepalese, you know, oming. And I would have never imagined it to go that far in terms of imagination. So yeah, Gene is my man.
I mean, it's really remarkable. I looped your Moonlight Sonata track, you know, like 10 times back to back. It's just so cool. So when you didn't have to, though, do anything new, re-record or sample in particular. You used the tracks you had already previously recorded and just gave it to him, and he did his magic in the studio.
Yes, and he did a lot of magic, because, you know, now that I think in hindsight, it would have been actually easier if I had re-recorded these very metronomically, because what Gene had to do was to manipulate sometimes the music to fit in, like I said, within the beat. But the various layers of sounds that he came up with, and he wanted to way more. He wanted to do way more, but the purpose of the record was to still keep people relaxed and not give them too many layers to analyze. But I know that if I let him, he would really go to town with his creativity.
Well, maybe the next reiteration of the series is an awakening, you know, and then...
I would love to make one with him, because yes, Gene is completely unstoppable, and I just was in love with how he exactly, again, just worked across genres to make this compilation happen. And it's not easy for us musicians who have these very high standard and sometimes can get a little hoity-toity about, you know, certain pop vibes, you know, thinking, oh, well, that's too primitive for my ear. To make something that's simple enough yet satisfactory to our ears.
Yeah, look, I believe good music is good music across the genre, you know, so I'm in that camp 100%. And I applaud you for doing that. And of course, you know, your next project is equally interesting, the Debussy on Fifth Avenue, because it is a digital recording that you essentially made yourself for Yamaha. So tell us more about it. It's really, I think it's amazing. I do the same now at home. So how did that come about? Were you doing that previously?
Yes, that was an exciting project, and that was it came after probably 10 years of dealing with the Yamaha Disklavier technology. And so Yamaha Disklavier technology is essentially a piano player technology, which is not new. It's at least 100 years old now, or probably even more. Even don't we have the ragtime
piano rolls? And
that's right, on piano rolls. That's right. So, but what Yamaha did is just to perfected it really. So, I came to their studio on Fifth Avenue, hence the title, and played each piece of Debussy, which I wanted to record. So there are the cycles of Debussy, Estaemed, and the 2 books of Images on the album. And so I went and recorded them once. And there was no microphones involved in that recording. So the process is that the music is recorded into the piano. So what the piano is recording, and again, I have to stress the fact that it is an acoustic instrument with a computer built into it. So what the computer registers is the speeds of keys and pedals. And so each key is recorded up to more than 1,000 degrees. And I think the sampling happens 18 times a second. It's ridiculously...
NASA grade technology.
Literally. So, and the beauty of that was that I did not have to worry about the fire trucks outside or any of the external noises, because the sound wasn't really recorded. It was just the speeds of the keys and pedals. So once you record it, you take your USB drive and plug it into a computer, and your entire recording appears as a MIDI file. So just imagine the luxury for us pianists. If you brush a note, all you have to do is take it, click on it, and delete it. So once I realized, my God, how easy it is to do this, I went crazy. I thought, now I want to fix absolutely everything. You know, I want to make every chord perfectly weighed out, and all the little small runs, I want to make them super perfect. But then I realized, well, that's not going to sound like a person anymore. But if I wanted to, I could have done it, and it was difficult to resist that temptation. So then once it's done, you know, and I must stress again that I have only recorded everything once, which, as you know, in an audio situation, it would take a miracle to record it.
Of course. No, you play tracks and you do take after take. And I mean, it's a very long and hard process usually.
Exactly, yes. And so when you do multiple takes, you know, you're a person, your heart beats at different speed from 1 minute to another. So sometimes the tempos end up not matching, and it's just one big frustration.
Or even the energy. I find that the energy with me is the hardest thing to, if you ever need to make a splice, because even though the speed may be the same, or even dynamic approximately the same, it's how you arrive at that sound.
That's right.
How you will that sound into being is different. And then I mean, I can hear the edit, you know, maybe people who aren't listening so carefully, who don't know the other alternative, right, they won't, but that always bothered me so much about cutting.
Exactly, yes. And the worst thing you can end up with is a clean recording that sounds tired, right, and lifeless. So that was simply not in question. So okay, so once we've finished the editing process, which was very quick because all you do is just erase a couple of brush notes, you put the USB drive back into that very piano in which I recorded it, and it will reproduce the performance by moving the keys and the pedal. And so that's when you actually turn on the audio microphones. And so that's when you do need that a little bit of that quiet time, because it ends up being a live recording, except I'm no longer sitting at that bench, but it's still my playing, now slightly airbrushed.
Yeah. So what's really cool, really to simplify everything down to the bone, is that it captures your actual performance authentically and completely. And once it is essentially edited, which is what happens to all performances anyway, in a long and tedious mastering process in the studio that can go on for dozens of hours, then the performance is yet again recorded, but now acoustically, and that is what the audience gets to hear.
Exactly. So the digital part is only the first part of the equation, but in the end, you actually do have a traditional audio recording, except it's, you know, as perfect as it can be from the beginning to the end.
Brilliant. I love it. It's truly a 21st century now, with all of that wonderful technology enabling us to really make the kind of art that is not meant to be made, you know, in a moment in real life. I always say, you know, the beauty of recordings is not to replace live performances or to pretend that they are, is to make the impossible possible, that which is only possible in that recording. And our live performance should never attempt to match it, because it's a separate art form.
Absolutely, yes. And it's, you know, you're putting a frame around where you are in your work process, right? It's like taking a photo of yourself at this certain moment. In the photo, you already look different, right? But it's a wonderful kind of document of what you have done and what you were thinking about at the time, which doesn't make it easier for us to listen to our own recordings as time goes by. Because, and we know that is the case with the greatest artists. You know, I always remember the story where Christian Zimmermann, who, as we know, he's such a sublime musician, he recorded the four ballades of Chopin for Deutsche Grammophon, and then decided to withdraw it from the market, by which time it was already too late because the CDs were printed and out on the market. But he was so miserable that people had to hear the recording, with which he was not so happy.
Right. Well, look, that's always a debatable, interesting question. I mean, the artist owning his art absolutely like this. I'm sure it was a beautiful performance. People loved it. And, I was always told by my mentors, there's a moment at which you have to let go of your art. Or as a composer, if I write a piece, you really have to complete and stop revising it, because otherwise you can spend like Da Vinci your entire life painting a Mona Lisa. And I mean, good for us, but miserable for him, perhaps, and so I've kind of taught myself how to do it, and to just leave things as they are and stop overanalyzing them once they're done. And recently I listened to some very old, recordings from competitions of myself, and I forgot playing it. So I no longer remembered what I thought I wanted to make. In recent recordings, you always remember your intentions. Once the intentions are forgotten, you listen to it as though it's someone else's recording. And then you can really kind of enjoy it or not enjoy it, but you no longer, it no longer belongs to you.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's so well said. That moment when you make that first step towards the stage, you have to put that frame around your work and say, this is what I can do today. And if it ends up a mess, then I have to forgive myself, right? And it's difficult because the digital technology and the CD making and and as you said, even the live recordings are not really live because they're done in multiple takes and then corrections are added to them later. It has put us musicians under that pressure of being perfect. Meanwhile, Abby Simon, who just recently passed at age 99, apparently his reason for moving to Europe was to escape that pressure and to be allowed to play with, what he called the inspired imperfection, which I so much love because, yes, it is, we're only human, and this is a document of what we are and what we have achieved for the moment, and tomorrow it may be better, it will be certainly different, right? So I think it's important for us, for our growth as musicians and as people too, right?
Absolutely.
For a lot of young musicians, aspiring artists, that's something to certainly keep in mind, not to beat themselves up for performances that they're maybe not so proud of.
Yeah. Look, we're animate creatures living in an increasingly digital world, and it will only continue to be so, and it can be wonderful if we have the right approach and attitude towards it, right? So take advantage of the recordings, of digital capacities and the things, but don't try to become artificial intelligence, because we invented it, but we can't be it, right? What is your next project, if you don't mind my asking, and if you're willing to share? What will be your yet to be done digital recording?
Well,
or not digital?
I actually have a Scarlatti album in the oven right now. So it was done with the same technology at Yamaha. So we have almost finished editing, and we were interrupted by the pandemic, but hopefully we'll soon be able to do the audio part, the so-called printing part of the recording.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be called, guess what, Scarlatti on Fifth Avenue. I'm just so addicted to this technology. I think it's great. It will be very difficult to get back to a traditional recording studio after that. What else am I doing? Well, now that we're all in confinement, I have been recording these weekly performance mini lectures called Back at Home. And I started with the music of Bach, because I'm just so passionate about the endless questions that one can ask. And perhaps my listeners end up with more questions yet than I ever answer. But before the pandemic broke out, luckily I had a couple of great books with me at home, because a lot of them got stuck in my office, which makes me in my office at Columbia University, which I cannot access at the moment. But the ones that I did have, I wanted to put to work in those Back at Home projects. So I'm quoting my favorite harmonicor, who talks about performance practice from a very kind of live, healthy kind of musician perspective, because it's very easy to get lost in the musicological intricacies of this music, but we must always remember that this is music that has flesh and blood and is very much alive. So what I propose in these episodes is a piano and a harpsichord performance of a prelude and fugue, let's say, or an invention or a minuet, followed by a short discussion. So that's what I do.
That's wonderful.
My
And what is your YouTube channel where people can watch it?
Oh gosh, it's not easy to spell, but it's my first initial and last name, Baczewska 88 as the number of the keys on the piano.
Yes.
And maybe we can link it to...
Oh, of course, we'll link it to this video, yes, because I think it's wonderful.
Fabulous. And tonight I am starting to grade the final papers of my students whom I taught music humanities at Columbia all semester. So yeah, in the midst of the semester we were moved to Zoom platform, and I was afraid that I would lose them because of that physical separation, but we have really bonded over the experience, and it was very touching. And I got really very moved by some of the notes that came from the students saying that one, for example, just right after the semester ended, she left for South Korea, and she was required to stay in a quarantine hotel for 2 weeks. And she said that it was the playlist from our class, all these masterpieces of Western music, that kept her going throughout that time. And I was so touched to read these words because, you know, it's a required course of all Columbia undergraduates. And these required courses tend to be the ones that you forget the fastest. And to know that the music carried meaning for her in this difficult situation really meant a lot. Another student wrote to me saying, you know, Professor, I learned the piano only to be able to get into college. And so now that I'm in college, I actually really feel into the music. I never saw that the way that I never did before. And he says, in fact, I have just started a classical music blog. You know, so it seems that the power of music, despite the physical separation, remains very strong and keeps inspiring students in ways that I couldn't even imagine at the beginning of the semester.
Well, it seems, I mean, it just proves the point that music has this ambassadorial role in the world at large, that it is in the times of the good times, it's just even more wonderful. But in times of crises, people look for solace and they look for meaning anywhere they can find it, and music is a very available and a beautiful source of it. And bless the technology that we can all do what we're doing right now, right? But you have done that prior to the pandemic with the virtual center for the seniors, am I right?
Yes, you know, I do think of them very often because, you know, the confinement that we hate so much right now and just wait to get out finally is something that is really business as usual for these seniors, and then they're scattered in the New York area. So they are homebound, but they are completely with it, you know, mentally, and they're just very lonely. So when I found out about this program called the Virtual Senior Center, I immediately jumped and it has been at least 5 years now that I've been with them. And I get together with them, with the seniors for class where we discuss music of Chopin, and sometimes the discussion takes us to the opera. Of course, how could you not talk about opera when you talk about Chopin? But I sometimes see those seniors with tears in their eyes, remembering an event at the opera from 50 years ago, perhaps. Some of them have unbelievable amounts of knowledge on various subjects, so I end up learning from them as well. But the general agenda is to just keep them from feeling lonely. And all of us have now sort of been through this, except we have had that hope of finally ending this confinement one day, and those seniors don't have that. So yeah, they have been on my mind a lot, and I think of their courage and how they get through each day without a kind of a clear exit strategy. So and I'm very happy to see that so many volunteers have come forward to work with the seniors. So now they have language courses, they even have gymnastics, they have computer skill courses.
That's remarkable.
Wonderful initiative.
That's beautiful that you're doing it, really. And which platform do you use? Zoom, or?
You can imagine, yes, we use Zoom. So when Columbia had the emergency Zoom training for all the faculty, I was completely comfortable already, having worked with the seniors. You know, we have been screen sharing, and sometimes I attempt to also play live for them. Unfortunately, the limitations of sound transmission are still rather severe on these online platforms, but I want to make them feel that this is something done especially for them, and that they're getting
right
performance live.
Well, that's what it's about. I mean, I'm sure that the companies are working overtime to up, the quality of sound transmission, all of that, which largely reliant on the signal strength of your internet as well. So, but it is the moment, that immediacy in the moment, that I'm sure matters to them more than anything.
Certainly, yes. And I think that, in that setting, it means more than the perfection, yes, of the sound. But by the way, I'm sure that you have also been admiring what has been done by various orchestras, by various companies.
Absolutely. I mean, it really, the sky is the limit of what can be accomplished. And I think we're really kind of being shoved into the 21st century proper, technologically speaking, right now by this pandemic, and the world will evolve, and once everyone is safe, it will be a more interesting, more technologically varied life for all of us. We just have to, the learning curve is imposed, and it's very immediate and steep to some, but it's an interesting process. And now, of course, I wanted to chat a little bit with you about personal style and fashion, of which you are such a beautiful embodiment. I mean, you were an MC of an award ceremony of the American Chopin Society in Miami, and you looked fabulous. But, that is the kind of role that is usually, assigned to someone who isn't just qualified intellectually or musically, but can carry themselves with a certain grace and gravitas, and looks, becomes a face of an event, and it's an important event, in American music life. Tell us a little bit, how did that come about, and generally, what's your relationship with fashion, with style? Do you think about it as a costume, or is it just like air, something you do every day, brush your teeth, make yourself up and go?
Well, I do pay a lot of attention to fashion, and this is something that I have yet to look forward to, which is own the pieces that I really want to own, instead of admiring them from afar. But I'm sure you will agree, because you're a fashion icon yourself, that it is a lifestyle, it is who you are, and it is an extension of your personality, right? And we know of various performers, and Yu Jiawang, of course, comes to mind as somebody whose dresses have caused huge controversy, but she maintains that it is something that makes her feel more self-assured and more herself. And I believe that this is an extension of your courage to go out there and present yourself. I am very minimalistic with my outfits, and there's only one color that exists for me, and that is black. Other than that, I just accessorize, because when I shop for pieces, I want to make sure that I can use them multiple times. And I wonder what, maybe it comes also from my communist Poland upbringing, where there was just nothing in the stores, and my grandparents were the survivors of World War II, so everything was extremely sober, and you wore your shoes until they wore out, not until you got bored of them. So I still have that durability, kind of prioritized in my mind. So I choose pieces that I hope will be timeless in my closet, and then I just adjust jewelry and scarves. The scarves are my big love because they just...
And certain orange boxed scarves, I think.
You said it. Yes, they are irresistible, and they create moods that you can wear them in so many different ways. So to me, that's sort of the essentials. But when you mentioned the Chopin competition, that was a super fun event for me, because I could actually wear outfits that would not work well for performance, because I had this top that was sort of low down on the shoulders. I could never wear this if I were playing the piano, because it would keep coming up. And I also had this velvet skirt with a huge slit. So if I were to sit down at the piano, it would totally lose its charm. So some clothes are only good for standing. And so that was my occasion to wear those standing only outfits, while trying to entertain and educate the audience a little bit during the final stage of the competition, where well, as we all know, Chopin only wrote 2 concerti, and 5 of the 6 finalists played the first concerto. So if you're hearing the same piece 5 times in a row, you may want, you're probably craving a little bit of variety. So I tried to provide that, and little, fun facts, some anecdotes in between the performances. Right. And of course, then I had the honor of announcing that first prize winner, which was a thrill.
Yeah. Well, it's a life-changing experience for the winner. I mean, for everyone involved, it is a life-changing experience from a collegial and educational standpoint, but it is a large monetary award.
Yes, probably the biggest in America. I think the biggest as far as...
What is it, $100,000, right?
1,000 years, a recording contract, a major concert tour, and of course the admission to the Warsaw Piano Competition, which, as I told you earlier, was sort of the staple of cultural life for me. Yes, and I heard your discussion with Antonio Pompabaldi the other day competitions, and yes, it's a tremendous universe, and you yourself, as a winner of various competitions, can attest to that. What I really loved about interacting with the finalists was how closely befriended they seemed already. There was no rivalry the way I remember when I attended competitions at my early age. They were truly friends. They would come and ask each other, "Oh, can you sit in the hall and hear how the piano is projecting?" And they were offering truly constructive and positive advice, and a very nice sort of atmosphere. Which
I'm very happy to see that. When I was in my 20s and was doing competitions, there was a little group of friends that were still close friends with, that we did that for each other. But it wasn't, I think, as de rigueur, as it is now. I find that students right now are much kinder to each other, student as a folk, as a whole group, than we were, sort of.
Yeah.
And by we, I mean just generally the generation, the age group.
Yes.
Thankfully, I
wonder, perhaps it has something to do with the few positive effect of social media, where these contestants can connect ahead of time and root for each other in other ways. And I certainly don't remember having lengthy conversations or friendly gatherings during the time when I attended competitions as a teenager. And that was one of the main reasons why I hated going to competitions, because it just didn't feel like a celebration of music, which I thought that's how music should be shared, right? As a celebration, as a special occasion. And those were very stressful, those situations where you were just simply just one of the rivals that they did not leave me with the greatest memories of competitions personally.
Yeah. Well, I personally love when certain major competitions are beginning to really refer to themselves as festival, that have a competition element in it, because it's really a festive event to celebrate music and fraternity of musicians. as opposed to sort of Battle of Waterloo, you know, when you just fight and fight and fight, you know, till the last one standing.
Absolutely, you know, and especially for us pianists, we know that the countless hours that we spend in the practice rooms are lonely hours, right? So when you finally get out, you want to be in touch with people, you want to learn from them, you want to share with them. And so I think that past this COVID pandemic, we will appreciate that even more, that human touch, the person-to-person experience.
I agree with you. I think people are just waiting and ready to burst out of their rooms to be with each other and for each other. But because of this technology, we have been all along right now, but just virtually. And I, of course, want to ask you my favorite set of questions. What is the most unusual thing you've learned that is useful in your career?
Oh, that's a good one. Unusual. Perhaps taking the time and not always being the first one to speak up, but rather listening. You know, I think that, and again, this is a lesson from making music, right? Where you have to be as much of a listener as the producer of the event. Yes, being on the side of that side of you know, somebody who's perceiving the situation from the other. As I was mentioning before, putting myself in the shoes of the audiences. So kind of taking a step back, I think, has been not always easy, but very helpful and important. And it maybe is counterintuitive. That's why I list it as an unusual lesson.
Yes, no, that's brilliant. I like that, kind of an observer before you speak. What's your favorite book?
I guess, you know, it's going to sound stupid, but it's always the book that I'm reading. But I do love a book called 7 Days in the Art World. It is such a wonderful portrayal of the craziness of the world of visual arts and just arts in general, and how a lot of it may be extremely inflated, but it's also truly fabulous and very busy. It shows me the various layers of the art world of which we are not always aware, and I think it's hilarious, and it's written with panache.
Oh, it sounds like a must read to me. I'll check it out. What would you say to a parent of a student?
Oh, it's a good one. I'd say don't treat the music learning experience as fun and games, because there's a lot of that happening in pedagogy, especially in this country, but I think more generally now in the 21st century. It is a serious endeavor. At the same time, you know, really, so what I'm asking for is a balance, because at the same time, you don't want to have your child, your student, hate what they do because of the amount of pressure that's being put on them. And it's a very difficult balance to strike, because you have to be serious enough to understand that this takes countless hours of work and discipline and so on. But at the same time, if you end up being very proficient but hating your life, what's the point? Yeah.
That's very good advice. That's very on the money. What would you say to a teacher?
Again, listen to the soul of your students, because there is, as a teacher myself, I've seen that there's so much going on inside those people's spirits, and that certainly one method doesn't fit all. And because as music teachers, we have this rare opportunity to be one-on-one with our students, we we become very important mentor figures to them, whether we want it or not. And as I was telling you at the beginning of our conversation, my first piano teacher will forever remain my hero. And so we may not even realize how important of an impact we are making. So I think listening to them and allowing their soul to open up to us so that we can help it thrive. That's a very precious, delicate thing, but that's probably what I would recommend. Just listen.
That's beautiful. What would you say to a student?
Well, I have to just repeat myself here. Treat what you do with seriousness, but don't make things intense enough to scar you. I've seen that a lot with students who thought that, for example, learning how to play the piano was the only way to help their college application, for example. So having the right reasons for doing something, and sometimes it takes a lot of soul searching, right? But having the right reasons for doing what you do is so very important. And you may end up not being a professional musician, right? I worked with students up at Columbia who are biochemistry or computer science majors, and yet they are 100% committed to excellent music making. So the fact that you may not end up on the stage like Lang Lang or Yuja, it does not mean that you're not successful.
Yeah, well, it's a matter of relationship with music and attitude, right? Strive for excellence, but forgive yourself de facto, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yes. Do you believe in practicing hands separately?
No.
I love that one. I love to ask that.
That is such a good question. Absolutely. And I also believe in singing, the hands separately business. This is something that Bach's son, CPE, recommends, for finding the most natural way to phrase something. The human voice can never go wrong. So I do as much singing as I do practicing hands separately.
Brilliant. And final question is, what would you say to yourself at 20?
At 20, oh gosh. I would say, girl, you've got no problems.
That is so wonderful. Magdalena, thank you so much for spending an hour with me and sharing your extraordinary life and thoughts on music and fashion with us. And stay safe.
Real. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Till next time. Ciao.
Ciao.